everything and
Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Centrella, and I'm the Interim Chief Development Officer here at WAMU. WAMU's mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and the world. We offer our audience opportunities to learn and engage, both with the news as well as cultural conversations like this. Public radio works because listeners and members who value the service step up and give back. Support from listeners and members is also our most reliable and important source of funding, especially right now. This book club would not be possible if we didn't have your support. If you enjoy the discussion today, please consider making a gift to support this series of events. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. We are grateful to have you here with us today. A quick note, Diane is out recovering from a voice treatment, so this conversation was pre-recorded. You can interact with one another and our book club producer, Allison Brody, in the Q&A box. Closed captioning is available for this event. Just click the CC button on your screen. And now let's start the discussion with a message from the host of our book club, Diane Rehm.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the July meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. I'm currently recovering from a voice treatment, but we did not want to skip our July book club, so my guest, Clint Smith, graciously agreed to join me a few weeks ago. Clint Smith is a poet and author of the prize-winning book of essays titled How the Word is Passed, which looks at this country's legacy of slavery. We talked about his newest book, Above Ground, released in March. This poetry collection is rooted in Clint's experiences as a father and quickly became a bestseller. His poems explore the joys and challenges of parenthood, as well as race in America and the histories we pass down to our children. I hope you enjoy his poetry and insights as much as I did. Clint Smith, it's so good to have you on again. Lovely to have you as the guest for the book club rather than simply a panelist. So thank you.
It's so wonderful to be here with you. It really is.
Thank you. Above ground, your latest book of poetry and essays in poetic form, if I may say, begins with the poem All at Once. Can you read that for us?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you.
All at once. The redwoods are on fire in California. A flood submerges a neighborhood that sat quiet on the coast for 3 centuries. A child takes their first steps and tumbles into a father's arms. 2 people in New Orleans fall in love under an oak tree whose branches bend like sorrow. A forest of seeds are planted in new soil. A glacier melts into the ocean and the sea climbs closer to the land. A man comes home from war and holds his son for the first time. A man is killed by a drone that thinks his jug of water is a bomb. Your best friend relapses and isn't picking up the phone. Your son's teacher calls to say he stood up for another boy in class. A country below the equator ends a 20-year civil war. A soldier across the Atlantic fires the shot that begins another. The scientists find a vaccine that will save millions of people's lives. Your mother's cancer has returned, and the doctors say there is nothing else they can do. There is a funeral procession in the morning and a wedding in the afternoon. The river that gives us water to drink is the same one that might wash us away.
It's such a beautiful and complex poem. Tell me why you began your book with that poem.
Yeah, thank you so much for those kind words. That poem is in so many ways the thesis statement of the project. It is the part of what I'm wrestling with in the book is the sort of simultaneity of the human experience, the way that we move through the world, we move through each of our days filled with joy and love and laughter and levity. And in those same moments, in that same body, on those same days, we also move and feel a sense of anger, frustration, anxiety, and despair. And it's not the case that our lives are sort of neatly compartmentalized and demarcated into Monday is our happy day, and Tuesday is our distress day, and Wednesday is our anxiety day. It doesn't work like that. The reality is that we are often carrying all of these things alongside one another at the same time. And then specifically in the context of parenting, which is something that this book is thinking a lot about, thinking about what it means to be a father to young children. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. And part of what this book is trying to do was chronicle those moments with my kids, the unique nature of what it means to watch 2 little humans discover the world for the first time, and how that allows you to sort of rediscover these parts of the world that you might have otherwise forgotten or overlooked. And so it is, I'm thinking about how parenting is this thing filled with so much wonder and awe and almost sort of divinity, and is simultaneously filled with exhaustion and anxiety. It is the most beautiful thing you've ever done and also the most difficult thing you've ever done. And I didn't want to run from that complexity. I wanted to lean into it. And so the book is both about the sort of multifaceted nature of parenthood, the good, the bad, the difficult, the wondrous, but also the human experience more broadly, and how we hold the complexity of what it means to be a human in the world all at once.
I must say, my son is currently 62 years old. My daughter is 59. And you took me back in some of your poems about your children's very early beginnings, literally, and brought me to tears in the remembrance and in thinking about their lives then, their discoveries then, my discoveries then, because I was the younger of two girls, and you just brought it all to life. And I thank you for doing that. It was just so special. Starting there takes me into wondering about what the origins of this entire collection might have been.
Yeah, so my wife and I's journey to parenthood was uneven and uncertain. We were told when we went to a fertility doctor that it was unlikely that we would be able to conceive, and there was a sort of period of mourning what we thought our lives would look like, a period of mourning what we anticipated the process of building our family would look like, and what the sort of landscape of our future would look like. And we were fortunate that, sort of against the odds, we were told we had less than a 1% chance of conceiving, and we're incredibly blessed that my wife did become pregnant, and this is in September of 2016. And so it was this thing that both felt miraculous, but also so precarious and so fragile. And there's so much research, even though it might not be a part of our sort of public discourse, around how frequent, miscarriages are, even though those experiences, unfortunately, often remain unspoken. And I think there was the added level of fragility and the added level of uncertainty, given what we knew about the chances of us conceiving were at all. And so for me, writing and specifically poetry is the act of paying attention. It is the way I pay attention both to the world beyond me and the way I pay attention to the world within me.
Is that attention being paid both visually and inwardly?
It is. And I think that it is almost an act of mindfulness for me, right? It is in this moment, in this sort of technological ecosystem in which there's something that can always take your attention. There's something that can always remove you from having to sit with your feelings, remove you, strip you away from having to actually wrestle with what's happening in your heart and in your head.
And I remember the poem when the doctor said to you and your wife, the last line of that poem where you learn what he says is sorry, sorry, sorry. The doctor's words, I presume, but could have been your own inner feelings as well.
Well, I love that. And what I tell people all the time is that one of the things I love about poetry and art more broadly is that 1,000 people can read the same poem and come away with 1,000 different interpretations and 1,000 different meanings. So I love your sort of dual reading of it, and it's funny because we, speaking of technological moments we live in, I feel very lucky that my poetry and my work is taught in like middle schools and high schools across the country and across the world. It's more than I could have ever imagined. And part of what happens is that I will have students who sort of slide into my DMs on Instagram. And so they will send me messages on Instagram saying, Clint or Mr. Smith, my name's Mike Johnson, and I'm a 10th grader in Colorado, and we were assigned to read your book for our class, and I have homework due in 5 hours. Can you tell me what the cicada means on page 47? Which is really funny to me. And I think about, Walt Whitman didn't have didn't have this issue. Back in the day, there were no students sending him messages asking for homework help, as far as I know.
I had some worry about the book banning we're seeing. Do you worry that your wonderful earlier book, which won so many accolades, tell me the name of it?
How the Word is Passed.
Do you worry that that could be taken off the shelves for teenagers and almost adults?
It's possible, and it's certainly is happening already. I think almost what's more common than the explicit book banning as we sort of discuss it and understand it now, in the sense that, you know, your book is put on a list and prevented from being loaned out from libraries or included in school curriculums. I think what's more common is a sort of quiet banning that happens that doesn't necessarily get the same headlines. So, for example, about a year ago, I had a sort of big private school that had the students and the faculty had selected How the Word is Passed as their sort of common read for the school communities. They were going to get like 2,000 books, and I was going to come speak to the students in the school. And my agent told me that, a few weeks later, that the visit had been canceled and the book order had been canceled because the board of trustees had sort of vetoed the choice of having my book selected because they didn't want anything that had to do with critical race theory, as they sort of put it, or they put it in more veiled terms. But it was clear that that was the issue, and that is. I only know about that because it got to a certain point in the process and then had to be vetoed by a group of people who were sort of fearful of what this meant. But what I also know is true is that there are so many times in which, maybe students or faculty will want to read a book, and then parents or a board or some other body will prevent the process from even moving forward, or that sort of thing creates a chilling effect where, students might say they want to read this type of book, or teachers might feel inclined to bring this sort of book into their classrooms, but they don't even propose it because they fear or they anticipate that the higher ups will say no. And so there are multiple tiers, there are multiple spaces in which book banning manifests itself. Mm-hmm. So it's not only the school board who says this book cannot be taught in school. So much of it is the chilling effect that's created, and the way that the teachers and institutions and schools and students realize that certain books aren't even worth proposing in their minds because the fear that they'll be shot down anyway.
Tell me what you were trying to do with How the Word is Passed.
So How the Word is Passed is about how different historical sites across the country reckon with or fail to reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. I wrote it beginning in 2017 when I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching those statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And thinking about, well, what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography, they're not just symbols. They are reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy is what ultimately shapes the landscape of people's lives. And so that doesn't mean that if you just take down a statue of Robert E. Lee or change the name of, Jefferson Davis Parkway, that you suddenly create racial, economically egalitarian schools or reduce the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize, I think, the the ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help collectively ground our sense of what's been happening in American history and the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately harmed throughout American history. And so I travel around the country going to these different historical sites to try to get a sense of how different places across the country tell the story of their past.
At first, apparently, you were thinking about doing the book based on the statues that were coming down. What changed your thinking?
You know, as someone who writes across genre, I thought at first that this project, when it was just an idea, when I was watching these statues come down, I thought that maybe this book would be a collection of poetry. My first book was a collection of poems that came out in 2016, a collection called Counting Descent. And then I thought that this book would also be a collection of poems, and that the conceit would be that each poem would be about a different statue in New Orleans or a different piece of iconography in New Orleans. And that's how I would write about what my relationship was growing up to those statues, what it meant to ride my bike past Robert E. Lee, what it meant to feed the ducks with my mom under the statue of PGT Beauregard, what it meant to, watch a Mardi Gras parade full of beautiful Black people like walk down Jefferson Davis Parkway. All of these this sort of cognitive dissonance of the experience of living in a majority Black city full of Confederate statues and the names of slaveholders. And then I realized that I think I needed to broaden the scope of the project a bit. And so I realized both that poetry was my way into the project, but ultimately I needed more space. And I also needed to include the voices of other people, because if I was trying to capture the complexity and the heterogeneity of public memory, I had to capture a range of different voices that made sense of this history in fundamentally different ways. And so that meant going to places like Monticello in Virginia to think about how that place has changed over time in the way that it talks about Jefferson and his relationship to slavery. That sometimes that means going to Angola Prison, the largest maximum security prison in the country that is built on top of a former plantation. It could mean going to the Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg, Virginia, which is one of the largest Confederate cemeteries in the country, where I spent the day with members of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. And so I go to all of these different places because they all represent different manifestations and incarnations of our collective memory in this country. And I think only by talking to people and having those discussions and going to these places and putting your body in the place where history happened, do you get an intimate and more proximate sense of why the stories in all of these different sites are told in the way that they are.
Were you writing both how the word is passed and above ground sort of at the same time?
In many ways, yeah. And this is going back to your question a few minutes ago about sort of when above ground began. So my wife and I got pregnant with our son in 2016, and the statues didn't come down until 2017. But I was already writing poems to try to make sense of what I was feeling, how nervous I felt, how excited I felt. And then my son was born in May of 2017. And suddenly I was writing poems about what it meant to have a newborn and how incredible it was to hear him, see him smile for the first time, to hear him laugh for the first time. And also how hard it was to not get any sleep, and how scary it was when you hear him cry or get hurt. And then my newborn became a toddler, and then we welcomed my daughter. And so then I had a toddler and a newborn. And then I was writing a lot more poems about how little sleep I was getting. But at every stage, in so many ways, poems can serve as sort of time capsules, right? They're these things that allow you to remember who you were and how you thought about the world at these different periods of time. And so for me, each poem about my children is in so many ways an attempt to create that time capsule, to hold on to a moment, an image, a feeling, an idea, an utterance that I want to keep. It's almost as if the poem can help me archive these parts of my children's lives and these parts of my life that I want to remember. And, so I think there's maybe 70 something poems in this book, but I wrote hundreds of poems in this period of time that aren't included in the book. And so I'm writing, no matter what else I'm doing, I'm always writing poems. Poems are just, it's kind of my North Star. It's the way that it's how I think, it's how I process. And How the Word Is Passed, was written between 2017 and 2021. And throughout that entire time, I was writing poems to both process what I was experiencing, going to all these sites of memory and sites of slavery, and also thinking about the experience of going to these sites of enslavement and then coming back to my children and thinking of the generations of struggle that people took part in that made it possible for my children to be here. And so the connection was always there. Every time I saw their faces, I saw the manifestation of generations of people who fought to make their lives possible.
I understand. Would you read for us Ode to the First Smile on page 19? I just love this poem.
Ode to the First Smile. At first, I wasn't sure if it would really happen. Perhaps my eyes were wishing for something that wasn't there. But then you did it once more, as if to remind me I shouldn't doubt the creasing of your small eyes, the soft crescent of your flowering mouth unfurling at the edge. It happens as I am reading you a story about a turtle who spends each day going on adventures with other creatures of the sea. And as I read the turtle's conversation with his dear friend the octopus, suffused with jokes of seaweed and tentacles and how coral reefs always stay up beyond Christmas, you lift the borders of your mouth and swing your arms in delight. The haters say it's too early, that it probably was only gas and the spasms of new muscles. But we know better than to explain away such rejoicing. Besides, only 1 in 1,000 baby sea turtles live into adulthood, and we are reading about one of them, and he is talking to an octopus, and they are making homophonous jokes about the winter holidays, and what a glorious example of a miracle this is. So why would we not praise the flesh and all its fledgling movements? Why would we concern ourselves with how the turtle arrived in the water, when we could simply celebrate the fact that it is swimming safely out at sea?
That's wonderful. I can see you somehow looking at that child and looking very carefully to see that smile. How wonderful. At the same time, you bring us into a reality that many people may have forgotten, but not you, certainly not me. When people say, we have made it through worse before. Would you read that for us, please?
I'd be happy to. When people say we have made it through worse before, all I hear is the wind slapping against the gravestones of those who did not make it, those who did not survive to see the confetti fall from the sky, those who did not live to watch the parade roll down the street. I've grown accustomed to a lifetime of aphorisms meant to assuage my fears, pithy sayings meant to convey that all ends up fine in the end. But there is no solace in rearranging language to make a different word tell the same lie. Sometimes the moral arc of the universe does not bend in a direction that comforts us. Sometimes it bends in ways we don't expect, and there are people who fall off in the process. Please, dear reader, do not say that I am hopeless. I believe there is a better future to fight for. I simply accept the possibility that I may not live to see it. I have grown weary of telling myself lies that I might one day begin to believe. We are not all left standing after the war has ended. Some of us have become ghosts by the time the dust has settled.
You said you will not return, for example, to New Orleans because of what happened there. I gather that experience was so hard for you to see, to witness how much a part of you is what happened in New Orleans.
Hey, I don't know that it's necessarily the case that it's not that I won't return to New Orleans. My family is still there. My mom, my dad, my grandfather, so many others. And so I knew Katrina was 17 years ago. I'm 34 years old. So it was half a lifetime ago. It very sort of neatly bifurcates my life in this way that I have only begun to realize. And I think more than the feeling of not wanting to return, it's the despair at having been so suddenly stripped away from this place and never, it wasn't an amicable separation, if you will, right? It was in my senior year of high school. It was meant to be the culmination of my, at that point, a lifetime of, academic work and sports. And, there was senior prom, and there was trying to win a state championship with my soccer team. There was, feeling like I had finally found like my group of friends who were my people, feeling like, your senior year is supposed to represent at its best, all of the things that you have been working toward. And 3 days into it, we left and we didn't come back. And I finished my senior year of high school in Houston, Texas, and was very grateful for the school and the people and the communities over there who welcomed so many thousands, really millions of us in. And even when my parents moved back, it was to a different house. It was in a different neighborhood. And I had this interesting moment not that long ago when I was visiting my parents, where I realized that the home that they now live in is a place where they have lived for longer than they lived in my childhood home, which is so strange for me because the home they live in now has only ever been, like, I don't have a room there, right? I've only ever stayed in the guest room or on the couch. And so it's a reminder of how time is like only one metric that we use to determine our level of intimacy or a level of importance. I spent a shorter amount of time in my childhood home, but that was the place that formed me. That was the place that raised me. It was a place where all of my memories as a child were. and I think in connection to, my own kids, I think I mourn what it means for them to never, we bring them to New Orleans and my kids had their first Mardi Gras this past year, which was so much fun. And talk about experiencing something through the eyes of your children. It was remarkable to see their eyes light up at the parades and the music and the foods and the sounds and the smells. And also it made me sad because their relationship to that city that means so much to me, will only ever be one of visiting rather than one of home. And so it's interesting to think of a home, a place that shaped you so much, that is inextricably linked to your values, your sense of self. And my kids won't share that in the same way. We don't live in New Orleans. We visit. So it's something that I think about and wrestle with.
How do you think Katrina shaped your work as a writer?
Man, I think Katrina has shaped me in ways that I think I'm still only beginning to fully process. I mean,
tell me how you experienced Katrina. You apparently got out early.
We did. Yeah, we left early. We went and stayed at my aunt and uncle's house. I packed, a small duffel bag of clothes, a few books, maybe my Game Boy, and I think we left, and we were, Houston, New Orleans to Houston is usually between 5 and 6 hours, and I think we were in the car for 3 times as long as that, trying to get out with so many others, and I remember watching CNN with at my aunt and uncle's house outside of Houston, Texas, and seeing the church where we went, and the grocery store when we went, and all of these things and around my house under 10 feet of water. And it was, clear then that our home, like 80% of the homes in New Orleans, was submerged underwater. And it was unclear when we would ever be able to get back. And when we did get back, what that would look like, what the city would look like, not only physically, but demographically, culturally, socially. And so, Katrina is this thing that I've been in almost everything that I've written. There's like a small morsel of Katrina. There's a poem or two. There's a reference. But it's something that I've been working on a project for several years now, in which I try to write more directly into that experience. And it might be the case that it's something that comes out into the world one day, and it might be the case that this is just something that I have to do for myself. I think as writers, sometimes you don't know until much later in the process. But
how long after Katrina did your mother and father return?
Less than a year after. They moved into a different house near my grandfather, and both my grandparents. My grandmother was still alive at that time, and that was a neighborhood that sat closer to the lake, which means that water ran past it, rather than, because New Orleans is a bowl. So if you live near the lake, you tend to be at a higher elevation. So the water from the lake and the rainwater would sort of run past your house rather than sitting there. And so, yeah, the neighborhood that we live in now, that my parents live in now, was largely spared during the storm from flood damage. And they went back, and my sister and I stayed in Houston to finish our senior year. To finish my senior year, to finish 10th grade for her. And my younger brother, who was then, must have been in 6th grade, he went back with my parents. It was a strange, our family was not together. Our home, my parents were living with my mom's parents, and we were living with my aunt and uncle. And so it's this sort of, it's both this feeling, speaking of the simultaneity of our experiences, it's this feeling of gratitude that people are opening their homes to you, and that, we weren't in the Superdome, we weren't in the convention center, I didn't lose anyone that I loved.
There is a poem you wrote about it in this book on page 14.
So here, you might mean page 41. Maybe you.
41, not 14. Thank you.
No worries. Here nor there. I've tried to write these poems before. The ones about the infamous storm and its majestic violence. The flood water that swallowed a city, then sat still as night. I think often of the things that it took from us, that we'll never know we could have had. Nostalgia is a well-intentioned wound. Counterfactuals are a bed of thorns in a room with nowhere else to lay your head. I imagine what could have been, but never was. The Christmases with my children, in the home where I once opened presents, kicking a soccer ball with my daughter against the same playground wall where I imagined a life of goals and glory. That home is now silent as a sky of smoke. That wall is no longer a wall, but a pile of wood in a lonely field. I tremble at what I already know, that my children will not know the city beyond the holidays and funerals that bring them here, that I no longer know this city I have always worn like a tattoo. I still remember the city as something it was kept from becoming. I am still looking for a language, not covered in mud.
Clint, you now had multiple bestsellers in different genres. And you've read for us some beautiful poems, but you're also working in prose. And I wonder for you what the differences are as you come to each. Does your mind move in a different direction when you're allowing yourself to express in prose as opposed to the configuration of poetry? Tell me what the differences are in your mind, in your heart.
I think they are all extensions of the same sensibilities, the same literary and artistic commitments. And like I mentioned before, sometimes things aren't sort of neatly compartmentalized into a particular genre. Sometimes a project begins in one genre and evolves into another. I've had things that I've begun to write as essays that I realize are more suited as poems. I have things that I've begun as poems that I think are more suited toward reported long form narrative nonfiction. I have things that I've written as poems that have turned into sort of larger works of fiction. And for me, poetry is how I came into writing. I came up in the poetry scene, the spoken word poetry scene in Washington, D.C. and New Orleans. And it was those communities and those spaces that for me revealed the importance of the music of language, like what it sounds like when it leaves your tongue, when it leaves your lips. So no matter what form I'm writing in, even with How the Word is Passed, which is a book-length work of narrative nonfiction, I'm always thinking about the music of the language. I'm always thinking about the rhythm of the sentence, the structure of each sentence following one another, the meter, the sort of, the iambic nature of what the language is before me. So I'm always reading my work out loud. I find that to be the best, most effective process of editing. Sometimes it reveals to you where a sentence might need another beat, another syllable, where you might need to pause, where a sentence has gone too long, where maybe you should have a series of successive short sentences. And so much of that comes from coming of age as a writer in a performance context, and in a context in which you were meant to read your work aloud, and that was how the audience would experience it. So even when I'm writing works of nonfiction, I'm always thinking about the poetry that exists within the language.
Interesting.
And I'm always trying to be as intentional as I can about what language I use and how I'm constructing the sounds of each sentence.
Tell me your thoughts about the situations facing Black men today.
Well, I think Black men are like any group of people, diverse, pluralistic, multifaceted, complex, human. And so the things that face us collectively depend so much on the other facets of our identity, right? The experiences of queer Black men are very specific. The experiences of young Black men in, in large cities is very specific. The experiences of Black men who are the descendants of enslaved people, or Black men who were the children of immigrants. There are all sorts of iterations and all sorts of versions. And so, I'm always careful not to sort of overly generalize, but I think it is clear that, so much of that Black men since the beginning of American history have been fighting against stereotypes and depictions and renderings and caricatures that have been made of them that seek to sort of undermine their complexity, undermine their humanity, undermine the sort of nuanced emotional texture of our lives. And it's very easy to create simple, unnuanced narratives about, violence and crime and the ways in which Black men are responsible for or are perpetuating those aforementioned realities. But I think, I am a structuralist. I was trained by sociologists. I was trained by people who taught us to look at systems, right? And so it's impossible to understand the inequalities that Black men are on the receiving end of without understanding the ways that a history of public policy throughout this country has prevented Black folks and Black men and Black women from having access to the levers of upward mobility that would allow people to, en masse, meaningfully change the trajectory of their lives.
What about your son, who I think you said is now 6 years old? What do you tell him? How do you talk with him about the random acts of violence that are occurring and that so often are directed at Black men?
I think with my son and with my daughter, part of what I'm interested in, I wrote an entire book about the history of slavery. And so I take seriously what it means to engage with history, to think about the ways that a history of violence and oppression have shaped the contemporary landscape of inequality. So much of why I wrote How the Word Is Passed, because I feel like I didn't have the language, the toolkit, the information with which to push back against so much of the pathology that I was on the receiving end of as a kid growing up in New Orleans, the pathology that suggested that Black people were the reason that there was so much crime and poverty and violence in Black communities was because of something that was wrong with Black people. And it wasn't until much later in my life that I read books and articles and documentaries and encountered art that helped me understand that the answer was much more complex than that. And it wasn't any sort of that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is because of the people in those communities, or it's not because of the people in those communities, but it's instead because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. So I say all that because we have those conversations with my children all the time. All right, we talk about slavery, we talk about segregation. My wife's mother is Nigerian. We talk about history of colonialism and imperialism. Obviously, you do it in a developmentally appropriate way. You do it in a way that a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old can hear and understand, and in ways that won't inflict a sense of trauma on them. But we have those conversations. And so, we have the books in their little libraries about, kids' books about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Coretta Scott King and Ida B. Wells and so many others. And we have the children's books about the little Black boy who wants to grow up and be an engineer, and the little Black girl who wants to grow up and be a superhero, and the little Black child who wants to grow up and be a bottle of ketchup, right? Because what I want for my kids is both to understand the history that has shaped their lives and that has shaped the world that we live in. But I also want them to understand that they are not singularly limited by or tethered down by a history of violence and oppression. You understand that history of violence and oppression, but your life is only limited by the possibilities or by the boundaries of your imagination. And so I want their imaginations to be vast and expansive and endless. And I want them to, again, so much of what I'm interested in and what manifests itself in how the word is passed and above ground in all of my work is the both andness of our worlds and how we hold both a recognition of history and a recognition of the possibilities or a future all at once.
When will you begin to talk with both your son and your daughter about the dangers that could confront them as they grow into teenage life?
Yeah, I mean, it's as I said, you begin. I don't think that those are conversations that you have for the first time when a child is 14 or so, or 12 or something like that. I
Right.
do think that there is value and that it's important to begin versions of those conversations early. You are always careful to do so in ways that ensure that you are not making generalizations of entire swaths of people. Or entire groups and demographics of people. But I do want, and my son, we're very lucky. He goes to like a richly diverse school and kids from all different backgrounds, in lots of immigrant families and lots of racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity. We feel very fortunate that he's in that sort of environment, and we want him to value that. And, what we talk about is that I think for so long, there was this idea that like, we're all the same. Doesn't matter if you blue, white, yellow, purple, orange, like everybody's the same. We're not different. What we teach our kids, and I think what more people generally are teaching our kids now is that, well, lots of people are different. And that's amazing, right? And we don't have to pretend that there aren't differences in order to be friends with people or respect people. Or spend time with people. One of the lovely things is the ways about being a human is recognizing, looking around and thinking about, all the ways that we're the same and all the ways that we're different.
And amid all the wonderful poems about raising children and watching them grow and watching them learn, you write The Gun. And after you read it to us, I'd like to ask you just a little bit about it on page 68.
The gun. The gun heard the first shot. The gun thought it was a bursting pipe. The gun heard the second shot, and the third, and the fourth. The gun realized it was not a pipe. The gun's teacher told everyone to get on the ground. The gun's teacher went to lock the door. The gun saw glass break, and the teacher slump, and bleed, and fall silent. The gun texted its parents. The gun said, "I love you. I'm so sorry for any trouble I've caused all these years. You mean so much to me. I'm so sorry." The gun thought it would never leave the classroom. The gun moved to a closet filled with several other shaking guns. The gun texted its best friend in the group chat to see if they were okay. The gun waited on a response. The gun received one. The gun did not receive another. The gun waited for an hour. The gun heard the door kicked open. The gun was still in the closet and didn't know who had entered the room. The gun thought this was the end. The gun thought of prom and graduation and college and children and all the things the gun would never have. The gun heard more bullets. The gun heard, "He's down." The gun climbed out of the closet. The gun put its hand on its head. The gun walked outside. The gun saw the cameras. The gun hugged its sobbing mother and cried into her arms. The gun heard thoughts and prayers. The gun heard Second Amendment. The gun heard Lone Wolf. The gun texted its friend again. The gun waited for a message. The message never came.
Tell me why you wrote that from the gun's point of view.
I'm always interested, and I think this is something that poems can do. You asked earlier why I choose poetry versus nonfiction or any other genre at a given time. I think what I love about poetry is that it allows you to wrestle with a set of questions, even if you don't have an answer. And sometimes you begin the poem with one question and you end the poem with another. Sometimes, and I think a helpful exercise that I find really helpful for me and really generative for me in poetry is trying to write from the perspective of another, whether even if that means it's an inanimate object or a non-human object. In my first collection of poetry, Counting Descent, I have a series of poems in which non-human or inanimate objects are talking to a Black boy. So there's 5 different poems throughout the collection. What the cicada said to the Black boy, what the ocean said to the Black boy, what the cathedral said to the Black boy, and others that are imagining what those conversations from those spaces or those things might look like toward a young Black child. And I think it just allows you to enter the questions that so many of us are wrestling with in a different way.
I have one last poem I'd like you to read. It's called Halloween. And it made me laugh so much. I thought our viewers and listeners would enjoy hearing you read it.
I'd be delighted to. It is Halloween night and you are dressed as a hot dog. Why we have chosen to bundle you in a costume of cured meat, I do not know. But your mother is dressed as a pickle, and I am dressed as a bottle of ketchup. And together we make a family of ballpark delicacies. You have yet to eat solid food, but after you look at yourself in the mirror, you begin to chew on your costume, clearly compelled by what this mystery of pork and beef and puree and other unknown meats is done. We place you on the couch next to a large stuffed bear in hopes of taking photos to send to your grandparents. Because who are we to deny anyone the joy of an infant wrapped in processed meat? But you are just a few months old and thus unable to sit up straight for very long. So you fall over onto the lap of the bear, and your mother and I look at each other, realizing the perfection of what has just appeared before us. So we snap a dozen photos with the stuffed bear eating the human hot dog baby, which sounds unsettling but is actually adorable, and send them to the family group chat right away. You're probably annoyed, but we are delighted. And it doesn't even matter if we make it out of the house anymore, because the mission has been accomplished.
It's just wonderful. I want you, if you would, I said that would be the last one, but can you, for our audience, read the Andromeda? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
The Andromeda Galaxy.
Yes.
I would love to. If I can just find the page. Page
It
80.
is on page 92.
The Andromeda Galaxy is the closest galaxy to our Milky Way, and it is the most distant object visible to the naked eye. It is 2.5 million light years away, which means that when we see it, we are seeing that galaxy as it was 2.5 million years ago, long before we were ever part of this planet, long before you came into this world like a shooting star. We read this fact in one of your books about space, and you ask me how it's possible to see something from so long ago, even if that thing is no longer there. I am far from a physicist, but I do my best to explain the speed of light by moving my hand in front of my face as quickly as I can. You are unconvinced by this incoherent explanation, and now my arms are sore. So instead, what I say is that when I look at you, it's like I am looking at my grandmother, a woman you never met, but whose stardust is glimmering in your eyes. When I look at you, it's like I am seeing everything that came before. All the people I loved, who once lived but are no longer living. All of the history that has brought you here to me.
You've done it again. You brought tears to my eyes. Just beautiful. Clint Smith, I can't thank you enough for being with me today and with all the people who I'm sure have been so engrossed in your reading. Thank you for your writing, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It really means the world to be here with you.
Thank you. I want to thank Clint Smith for joining me to record a wonderful hour of poetry and conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining me today. Please do take a moment to fill out a short survey about the event that's going to pop up on your screen. Our next book club meeting will be live on Wednesday, August 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. A panel of guests will join me to discuss The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese, followed by a conversation with Dr. Verghese. So keep an eye on your inbox for more information. Our book club today was produced by Allison Brody. Kennedy Wright is our engineer today. Ellie Dickman is our events director. And this event wouldn't be possible without the support of Lawrence Centrella, Carly Cloud, Virendra Silva, and Michelle Keegan. A very special thanks to you and all of these people. See you next month. I'm Diane Rehm.